Alright, how's it going, y'all? Today we're going to be talking about how to install Nextcloud on a Raspberry Pi 4. This will work with any version of Raspberry Pi as far as I know, but we're going to be using the Raspberry Pi 4 because it's what I use on hand, and honestly, for an appliance like this, having that extra RAM is really going to help us out. And I've already booted up Raspbian off of an SSD. If you want to see how to do that, I'll leave a link to that in the description. It's really nice because it's so much easier than using micro SD cards. It's more stable and you can get huge files. So for this, I've got a 500 gigabyte SSD hooked up to this. And so I'm not gonna have to worry about having external drive hooked up. Instead, I'm just running everything off of one single drive. And that just makes this so much easier. All right, so first off, let's talk about what is Nextcloud. Nextcloud is basically Google Drive, but self-hosted. Their goal is to make it as easy as possible to switch away from Google Drive and all of their services and be able to really host your own cloud. It has a ton of features that are found in Google Drive. You can have calendars, you can have your photos synced in there, and it's all synced at home. That means you know where your data is. And it's also really focused on multi-users. That means you can have multiple people all having accounts on your Nextcloud server, and they can all share files with each other and have their own private files. It's a really nice way to keep those things separated, though I do need to tell you as the owner, you are going to have access to all of these files. This is because they're stored just regular files within the hard drive of the Raspberry Pi or wherever you set up your storage file. So that is just one thing to know, and you should be careful about this. If you're hosting a service like this, you should tell your friends, hey, I do have access, and just say, I'm not going to touch it. But it is a privacy thing, so it's just important to know that. Alright, and so I also could not start this video off without talking about security. Nextcloud is an open source project, and it's overall designed to be opened up on the web, but you've got to make sure that everything's pretty tight. It is a vulnerability if you were to set this up on port 80. It's a nice to have if you really need it, but I would highly recommend instead using a VPN server, and I've got a tutorial on how to set up your Raspberry Pi as a really fast WireGuard server. And if you're running a Raspberry Pi 4, there's no reason you should not have these two running in parallel and not have any performance issues. If you do really want to open it up on the web, I would highly recommend setting up a very high port number and using that to log in instead, because it'll add extra security. Generally, port scanners are not going to go above 5,000 because it takes so long to do it. And if you choose a random port, the one thing your friends are going to have to know is what port number it is. And so that is a really easy way to just add a little bit of security on there to keep everything better. What you can even do is you can set up a redirect. So you could run it at port 80 locally, then have your server actually forward the port 5236 or whatever to port 80 of your Raspberry Pi. This means when you're locally, you just use port 80, and when you're external, you would use that port. It's a really easy way of adding security without having to worry about too many config files or anything weird about that. But for this setup, we're going to be setting it up locally, and if there's a need, I can do future tutorials on how to open up on the internet, safely that is. Well, as safe as we can do it. It is a service running on the internet. Nothing is secure. Alright, so as we can see right here, this is the Nextcloud product page, and it's got a lot of cool features. It's got the ability to run messages, calendars, files, everything all hosted off of Raspberry Pi. It's a really easy setup that allows you to do a lot of things. It does have mail integration, though I'll be honest with you, I would not try to mess with that unless you're actually sending the emails from a different service. Alright, so there are two reasons why I would not really mess with trying to set up email at home. First off, you're probably not going to get any of your emails received unless you have the ability to have a static IP address and then have a reverse DNS lookup tying your host name to that IP address. This is a simple check that a lot of email providers do just to make sure that it's a legitimate account. Anyone can send anyone an email, and because of that, as you very well know, there are millions of spam emails out there. So many so that you don't even get all of your spam emails delivered to your inbox. Gmail sometimes just throws them out without you ever seeing them. And so it's going to be pretty likely that your emails just completely go undelivered. And so it's just going to be a huge pain. The second reason is, if you're hosting this at home and your power goes out or your internet goes out, there's a good chance that all of your emails that you've been getting do not get received. And whoever's sending you the email is going to get a notification, hey, we couldn't figure out where this was. And so that's just not a great setup, and it's going to cause you issues down the line. So I would recommend staying away from that. If you really want to, you can actually sync it with a service such as AWS and use that, but really, it's just going to be easier not to touch that part. However, everything else is going to work out really well. Alright, and so to set this up on a Raspberry Pi, we're actually just going to be using a script that sets the entire thing up for us. And so I found this via Own Your Bits, which is a great website that's actually helped me out a ton when trying to figure things out. And if we scroll down, they actually have this incredibly easy installer. And so as you can see right here, it basically has a install script that you run it and installs Nextcloud on your Raspberry Pi. And so as you can see right here, we're actually going to be running a script from the internet. And so what you need to do first before doing this ever is go ahead and copy it and just throw it in a web browser. And that way you can read what you're going to be installing and at least go through and understand what's happening to a degree. This combined with knowing who's written the script is a great thing, but it's good just to look through these and make sure that there's nothing too bad out there. It's so easy for somebody to just say, oh, by the way, set up a Bitcoin miner on this Raspberry Pi and send all the money to me, just because you ran a script that you didn't really know what it was going to do. And so I'm not going to go through this entire thing, but overall I would trust it pretty well. It's well commented and we can look through and see that overall it's got a good GitHub image that it's using, and so it really does just make you feel a little bit better. But if you're really worried about security, you can actually just go through and essentially follow every single one of these steps and command it yourself. That way you know exactly what's being run and why. Alright, so now that we've done that, and I'll leave a link to this article, we're just going to go ahead and copy this code and paste it into our Raspberry Pi. I've already gone ahead and SSH'd in here. And so all we're going to do is paste that code in here and run it. We'll type sudo su to become root and now paste it in there. And so as you can see, it's just going through and installing all of these packages for us. It installed a LAMP server for us. It's installed all the things we need without us having to go through and really set every single one of these things up. I would not recommend having this in a production environment, but because the database server is going to be run locally, it's really not that big of a deal, because we're just not going to open up our database, so that it's not a terrible security vulnerability with having an easy to guess password on the database, because, well, honestly, you're running this locally, you already have access to all the files in there. There's not that big of a deal if someone were able to break into this database, more so than they would have if they had access to your Pi. Obviously, if you're going to be hosting this for like 30, 40 people who are going to be putting sensitive things in that, I would not recommend doing this because it is not perfect. Alright, so wow, yeah, that took quite a while to install, but it has installed Nextcloud Pi, which is basically an add-on to Nextcloud that gives you a ton of extra features running on a Raspberry Pi. It makes a lot of things just so much easier, and it's got a bunch of extra features, which is really nice. And so it even goes through and gives us these instructions right here for basically how to set this up. You'll note right here, this is my IP address that's assigned to it. I've not set up a static IP address for this Raspberry Pi yet. I would recommend doing that, or you can just use this right here. But this is actually not true. For me, it did not update my host file, and I was still on raspberrypi.local. That's why I would not recommend using those host names, because they can change and really throw you off. So I'd really recommend setting up a static IP address for your Raspberry Pi. And so I've already got a video on how to do that, and I'll leave that in the description. You can also just assign it a static IP address from your router. Basically use DHCP and have a custom reservation for it. That's by far the most stable way of doing it, because then if your subnet changes or anything like that, it'll continue to use DHCP, but whenever you're local, it'll just go with that. I've actually moved away from using static IP addresses assigned on the machine to now using it on my router, because I went from the subnet 192 to 10, and so it threw everything off and I had to rebuild a lot of stuff that I could only access locally. So that is just one story that I've had. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to just copy this address right here, and we're going to go to it in our web browser. And so right here is going to say this connection is not private, and that's okay because we know we're hosting it ourselves. So we're going to have to do show details and go to visit manually, visit website, and type in our password. All right, and we're just going to click activate, and we'll change these passwords later on. They've actually got a great config that allows you to change everything from the command line, which I'm a huge fan of because it's so much faster and you can do it over SSH. So I don't have the username and password because I didn't want to deal with those passwords. So instead we're going to do it via GUI. And so we're just going to type in ncp-config, and I don't have to type sudo because I'm already as root. And so it's got the option to let us update. We may as well do that, so we'll say yes. It'll take a little while, but it's good just to get all this stuff out of the way as soon as possible. Makes your life easier. All right, and so now we've got access to the Nextcloud Pi config file, and it is a great utility, so much easier than having to type in all these different commands and go through everything. It's got a nice thing, and it's really easy for these guys to set this up, and I'm very glad they did. All right, so we're gonna go down into config, and we're going to change the admin. So currently, the Nextcloud Pi admin will leave the user as ncp, and we're going to change the password to password. And so I would obviously not recommend doing this for yourself, but I will have it as password. And I'm also now going to go down to change the Nextcloud Pi password. So that's actually two different services. There's Nextcloud, which is a Nextcloud service, and then there's on top of it, this basically interface is Nextcloud Pi. And so we're going to change that password as well. And interestingly enough, some special characters are not allowed here. I guess that's due to what they're using. It's good they tell us. And I'm going to call it password again. Once again, don't call this password. Or do, it's your choice. All right, and so now we're going to go ahead and do server limitations down here. And so what we can do is just say, I understand. And we're going to say the max file size, 10 gigs, that's pretty good. And then if we leave it as 0, that means that it is a automatic config. And so I like this. That way we don't have to try to figure out how much memory we want to give it. It'll all do it automatically. But if you do find yourself having performance issues, you can try tuning it here. Just make sure don't over allocate your memory or anything like that. And for max file size, I'm going to do 40. It's not necessarily the best idea to upload files this big because the HTTP connection can easily time out. But I like the ability to, just in case I really need to. And since I'm mostly going to be doing this locally, that shouldn't take too long. It is still going to take a little while, but I think it should be fine. And in a pinch, I'd rather be able to than not. And so I'm just going to click tab and enter. And so there are a bunch of other options here, but we're just going to go ahead and click finish. And this is where you can configure backup. So we'll go into networking and see what we need to do here. And this is where you can set up either a DDNS server or a DNS server, such as no IP. This allows you to access your Raspberry Pi Nextcloud instance outside of your local network. This is great because you don't have to remember an IP address that's going to change because it's not a static IP address. I've got a video on how to do this, but it's great they've set it up here. They also have the ability to include Samba in here, which is great. This means you can either use the Nextcloud web interface to get your files or also use SMB. I love this because it gives you both options, and trying to use a web interface if you want to edit a document is just a pain, and so I would really recommend looking at adding Samba in for that. But that's outside of this video, so we're just going to keep going down, SSH, yada yada yada. There's a lot of great things here. If you are planning on opening this up to multiple people, you're going to want to set up Let's Encrypt, but if people are interested in that, I can do that in another video. You can also go through here and set up a static IP address if you've not done that already. These are just a few of these things. I know I'm going through these quickly, but just pointing out some major ones. There's so much stuff here. And now let's go down to security. So fail to ban. So fail to ban is a really easy service that allows you to ban IP addresses that keep trying to access the Pi, who keep getting passwords wrong. Basically, people trying to brute force their way into your Pi, you can set it up to ban them either forever, for a couple days, for a few hours, anything like that. And it's a good thing to set up if you're going to be running this outside of your local network, because that way if people are trying to brute force their way in, it'll be able to ban them. And it also works for both SSH. Please don't open up SSH unless you really know what you're doing. And it also works for the web interface. So it's really good for that. And you can also set up your firewall here. It's overall pretty good. Finally, we'll go into system. And this is where they've got some really nice features that make it easy to do things that would otherwise be pretty complicated. For example here, they've got an auto mount feature. This is great if you want to be able to plug in and use an external hard drive for all of your files. You can just use this auto mount to mount the drive, and so you don't have to go in and edit the fstab file, which just takes a lot of things out. It can monitor the hard drive tests, it can test it. It's really nice to be able to see all of this stuff. They've done a great job of adding in just tons of features that normal people are going to be wanting to use on this. And now let's go into tools. And they've got fixed permissions, which is great. If you screw anything up, you just go, hey, fix permissions, format the USB. I don't know if I would use BTRFS. I know if you're a Synology user, I talk all the time about how good BTRFS is on Synology. I've heard issues with people using BTRFS outside of Synology's. Synology's done some under the hood tuning to get BTRFS working just right, and it has no problems that I've seen so far. But I have heard of people having data loss using BTRFS. I think if it's not perfectly configured for your system, it might not work great. And so unless you really have everything tuned well and you know what you're doing, I might just stick with ext4. But then again, that could just be me being overcautious. And so a couple of things here. You've got maintenance mode. It kind of lets you take down the site and work on some things. Previews are for images and things like that. It creates smaller thumbnails that can be easily loaded on the server. If you have like a 20 meg photo, you don't want it trying to load that for 60 of them on the thing and just absolutely slowing down your Pi. And then there's also scan. This is for files that are changed externally. So if I use SMB to copy something over, it might not end up in the web interface quickly. So if that happens, you can use a scan. But you can also set that up as a cron job. And that is it. You can also do your updates and your backups. But overall, that's the gist of what's available in this tool. I know I went through that fast. Leave any specific tutorials you'd like to see me make in the comments below, and I can go over them then. All right, so now we're going to be out of this and just go ahead and click finish. And so now we're out of it. I'm also going to exit out of root. Just good to do, and clear to give us some space. All right, so now let's just go ahead and do a reboot. That way we don't have any weird hiccups later on. So to do that, I'm just going to type sudo reboot. All right, so now I've let it reboot, and I've gone ahead and gone to my IP address, just like we did earlier. And so now that username was ncp, and it was password for me. All right, so finally that worked. Big problem, I realized. So if you look back in the video, and I'll probably point out in the thing, when you go through the Nextcloud GUI, there's actually an underscore. I thought that was my cursor. That underscore is a space. And so I typed in the wrong password, was super confused why it was not working. Note to self, that is a space. So if you have any issues logging in because you changed the password, that's probably why. But now we're finally in. I've gone through and I just redid the Nextcloud install setups. And now we're in Nextcloud Hub. And so it's a great, easy thing to set up. We're just gonna go through the original menu. We can look through it. Yada, yada, yada. It's got a bunch of information. It is great. I'm just gonna close this out. So let's start off by, we'll set our location for our weather. It does a great thing. So now it's got our weather. It's really nice. It just makes everything really easy, and it feels pretty polished, honestly. You can also sync in your calendar and use that there. So now let's go over to the files. And so now this is so much like Google Drive. You've got your documents, you've got your photos, and you've got everything. It's got thumbnails and everything you could possibly want, and it honestly loads pretty snappily. If you want to upload files, it's incredibly easy. All you do is click this plus button. I'll upload a file and go and select an image. And just like that, it's brought up, and it makes a thumbnail almost instantly. It's really easy to use and feels so much like Google Drive. One thing I don't love is that there's not a great batch uploader, but you can easily solve that by using WebDAV to just copy over your files. There's also a photo section, and it actually just goes through and looks at all the photos on your home folder, and so that image I just uploaded was automatically brought in here. It's really easy. We've got activity, you can see all these things, yada, yada, yada. As you can see, I reset my password quite a few times trying to get this to work, but it is all good now. So now let's go to the Nextcloud Pi dashboard. And so this is actually that same issue I ran into, so NCP, and my password is going to be password space. It was an underscore, not a space. So my password was a password underscore because they left an underscore in there. I think they couldn't have non-zero characters. That is one annoying thing. It just shows it's not perfect, but overall it's really good. And this is where you've got a web interface for everything you need. You've got all the information you can have, all running it off your Raspberry Pi, and just makes using it so much easier. You've got rsync options. You can basically go through and send out your data to back it up to another computer. You've got a very easy setup here for configuring everything. You've got easy access to your admin. You can change where your data is stored. So if you were to mount a hard drive on media/USB drive, you could basically copy over your files first, then change it to this. That way you would be storing all these media files off of a hard drive, which would be much better than storing it on the SD card on your Raspberry Pi. I've actually got this hooked up with a SSD already because I'm running it off a Raspberry Pi 4, and so I'm actually just loading the operating system on a USB drive that is an SSD. It's great to have that and means I don't have to have an X drive hooked up. And it's just got all the options you could really want. Overall, they've made this really clean, and it's easy to go back to Nextcloud. All right, so now let's do a couple more admin things. We'll go and start off by creating a user. So to do that, we go up here, and we're going to go to users. And we're going to create a new group. We'll say family. So now let's go ahead and create a new user. And I'll put the username as Will, display name as Will, password, email, you can set up here, and you can choose what group to put it in. I'd actually recommend not putting yourself as an admin, but instead having a second admin account. This way you only get the admin privileges when you need them, and it's just better for everybody, and just add. And so that's how easy it is to add users. I will give you a note, I actually did run into an issue where I had the Nextcloud config up and running and trying to do things on the database. It actually caused a conflict and I had to close out of Nextcloud config on my Raspberry Pi. So I would not recommend running those two together if you're also doing things like adding users. That's just a problem I ran into, but I don't think it should be too big of a deal. We can go in and edit the user's password, considering I already forgot it. And now let's go ahead and change our login. All we have to do is go up here, log out, and we'll do Will. And just like that, we've logged in as the new user. It's really easy to go through, and now if we go up here, we don't have all those admin settings. And so that's honestly how we go. We can set up alerts, and you can honestly do just about anything. It's a really great way of hosting everything yourself and being able to really sync up and have your own Google Drive without worrying about somebody else controlling your data. You control all your data here. There's a ton to do in Nextcloud, so I'm definitely gonna have to do a bunch more videos in this. So go ahead and leave any other tutorials you'd like to see me make in Nextcloud, or really anything else, in the comments below. That way I can try to figure out what people wanna see and do those videos. All right, so that's gonna be the end of this video. I think we've covered everything that you need to get set up for. I'll be covering more Nextcloud videos in the future. Well, that's it. Have a good one. Bye.